It was a cold, foggy evening in the small English village of King's Abbot. Dr. James Shepherd had just finished his dinner when he received an urgent phone call. The voice on the other end belonged to Parker, the butler of Roger Ackroyd, a wealthy businessman who lived in the grand Fernley Park estate. Parker sounded distressed as he informed Dr. Shepherd that Mr. Ackroyd had been found dead in his study. Dr. Shepherd quickly grabbed his medical bag and rushed to Fernley Park. Upon arriving, he was greeted by a distraught Parker who led him to the study where Roger Ackroyd's body lay slumped in his chair, a knife protruding from his back. It was clear that Ackroyd had been murdered. Dr. Shepherd examined the body and determined that Ackroyd had been dead for about an hour. He then called the police. Within half an hour, the study was swarming with officers, led by Inspector Raglan. Raglan questioned the household staff and learned that Ackroyd had dined alone that evening and then retired to his study around 8 p.m. No one had seen or heard anything suspicious. It also came to light that Ackroyd's niece, Flora, and her fiancé, Ralph Patton, had been staying at Fernley Park. Ralph had left the house after an argument with Ackroyd earlier that evening and had not returned. This made him the prime suspect in the eyes of the police. The next morning, the famous detective Hercule Poirot arrived in King's Abbot. Poirot was an old friend of Roger Ackroyd and had been invited to Fernley Park a few days earlier. He was shocked to learn of Ackroyd's murder and immediately offered his services to solve the crime. Poirot began his investigation by interviewing all the members of the household. Flora told him about the argument between Ralph and her uncle. She said they had disagreed over money. Ralph had asked Ackroyd for a loan to cover some debts, but Ackroyd had refused. This seemed to provide Ralph with a motive for murder. However, as Poirot dug deeper, other potential suspects emerged. He learned that Mrs. Ferrars, a wealthy widow who lived nearby, had died the day before Ackroyd's murder. There were rumors that Ackroyd and Mrs. Ferrars had been romantically involved, and that she had left him a large sum of money in her will. Could someone have killed Ackroyd for his inheritance? There was also Ackroyd's secretary, Geoffrey Raymond, and the housemaid, Ursula Bourne. Both of them seemed to be hiding something. Raymond was very nervous when Poirot questioned him, and Ursula burst into tears and refused to speak. As the days passed, Poirot pieced together the clues. He discovered that Ralph Patton had a solid alibi for the time of the murder. He had been seen by several people in the village pub. This meant that the killer had to be someone else in the household. Poirot's suspicions fell on Geoffrey Raymond. He had found a letter in Ackroyd's study from Mrs. Ferrars, written on the day of her death. In the letter, Mrs. Ferrars confessed to killing her husband years ago and said she was going to take her own life out of guilt. She also hinted that someone else knew her secret and was blackmailing her. Poirot confronted Raymond with this information. Under pressure, Raymond confessed that he had been blackmailing Mrs. Ferrars and had also stolen money from Ackroyd. When Ackroyd found out, he had threatened to call the police. Raymond had panicked and stabbed Ackroyd with a knife from the study desk. But there was one final twist. As Poirot was preparing to leave Fernley Park, Dr. Shepherd approached him with a troubled look on his face. In a shaking voice, he confessed that it was he who had killed Roger Ackroyd. Dr. Shepherd explained that he had been in love with Mrs. Ferrars, but she had rejected him in favor of Ackroyd. Consumed by jealousy, Dr. Shepherd had poisoned Mrs. Ferrars, making it look like suicide. Ackroyd had figured out the truth from Mrs. Ferrars' letter, so Dr. Shepherd had gone to Fernley Park that night to confront him. When Ackroyd threatened to expose him, Dr. Shepherd had stabbed him in a rage. Hercule Poirot had solved the case, uncovering the tangled web of secrets and lies that had led to Roger Ackroyd's murder. Dr. Shepherd was arrested and confessed everything in detail. The small village of King's Abbot was left reeling from the shocking events, but with the killer brought to justice, life slowly began to return to normal. In the end, Poirot reflected on the complex motivations that could drive a seemingly respectable man like Dr. Shepherd to commit murder. It was a reminder that even in the most peaceful of places, dark passions could lurk beneath the surface, waiting to erupt with devastating consequences. As Poirot boarded the train back to London, he couldn't help but wonder what secrets the next case would bring.